of Scotland should be mobilised to make sure that refinery stays open. If that refinery closes, as you know, we'll be the only oil-producing country without its own refinery. So there are a whole host of steps that we as electors, as voters, as citizens of Scotland should be taking. What we ought not to be doing is losing heart. Easy though that might be to be at the moment, we should not be sitting on our hands. We should be mobilising and encouraging each other to be united, create a united front, and get a campaign together for next year that gets us over that line. If we are not united, if we continue as we've been in the last few years, then we know that there will be another 5 years of moribund government where you're going to have unionists and nationalists slagging each other off in the Parliament, and Scotland's resources will be bled down south. We'll continue to bankroll weapons of mass destruction on the Clyde. Our people will continue to live in poverty. We will continue to have record numbers of drug deaths, alcohol deaths, deaths by suicide. Educational attainment for our children will not be what it should be, and our country will not realise its potential. And for me, that says it all. We have all got to get out there and absolutely strain every sinew and every muscle to persuade all party politicians and those of independent organisations to get together, break bread.
Okay, thank you very much, Eva. And next, I think we'll have Alan, if you would like to.
I mean, I agree with everything that Eva said. I mean, but we've got to get away from this mindset that we want independence, because it's gone beyond want. We need independence. We have many people suffering in this country through Westminster's policies. Our government have their hands tied. But for many years we were told to wish for independence. That's not acceptable anymore. Our government need our backing, and they need to be told when they are doing something wrong. If anything that should happen is the government should be wishing on their unpopular policies. Their policies could wait until after the elections in an independent Scotland. Everything that is controversial should be put aside. What we must do now is unite every single yes voter and yes campaigner, getting them on the streets. Now, one of the things that the unionists have is tools. They have good campaigning tools. ALBA have a campaigning tool, SNP have a campaigning tool, but it costs about £30,000 a year to run. Indie for Indie, along with the PRISM team, have paid and developed a new app called Campaigner, which will put us on a level playing field with everyone else. And I just checked it up today because I asked one of our colleagues to put the postcodes of Brechin onto it, and that is now done. So we can now get out on the streets and campaigning. Now, the information that's on the app is the exact same information that's on the electoral register, so it doesn't breach the GDPR. The information that we collect then goes into a secure cloud, which was created by someone who works in cyber security, so it's very, very secure. And I am the data controller on that, so nobody else gets that information except for us. It will not be sold on to everyone else, it will just be used for election campaignings, and it's important that we use tools like that to put us on a playing field level with the unionists. Now, we have major problems in this country, but the vast majority of these problems come down to one specific, and that is poverty. Every time Westminster do something, it is increasing the levels of poverty, especially in Scotland. I mean, we have the steel industry being nationalised because it's based in England. We'll have Grangemouth closing because it's based in Scotland. There'll be many people in Grangemouth losing their jobs, not just in the refinery, but throughout different sectors there who feed into that plant. We have to unite every single party in this. That is the most important thing of this campaign. And it's not waiting until 2026, it's campaigning now. The time for waiting is gone. We need to liberate our country. And we already have Salvo and Liberation.Scot going to the United Nations. Now, one thing that will do if we win that case is it will blow out the water the Westminster argument that nobody will recognise an independent Scotland, because it will be made very, very clear from the UN that every other country will recognise an independent Scotland. And only by doing that will we be able to have the macroeconomic policies that we need to eradicate poverty. When we eradicate poverty, we will then eradicate the drug problem. We will eradicate every other problem that this country faces. But without the macroeconomic policies, there is absolutely nothing we can do.
Hello, I don't sound as though I'm Scottish, although I was born in Ayrshire. It's just that when I was 6 we emigrated to New Zealand and we came back in '93. I'm a member of ISP. ISP was formed about roughly 18 months in advance of the 21 election. I've held various offices in the party. I'm well known, etc. ISP has joined with Eye for Eye in Liberate Scotland. We are walking the walk in terms of uniting. ISP has also very much been involved in Salvo and Liberation. Our leader and deputy leader hold positions in Salvo and Liberation. Everyone in ISP is encouraged to join Salvo and sign Liberation. It is a major plank of ISP, along with women's rights. And of course we're very, very disappointed with John Swinney's reaction to the Supreme Court judgment. He seems to be ignoring it. Although finally Starmer came out today. Although he said guidance a lot. And I think the devil will be in the guidance. So we need to watch the guidance on that one very, very carefully. I agree with Alan about poverty. I work in a low decile school in Dundee, and it's a big issue. In our foyer and in the foyer of the primary school next door, there are racks of clothes, of school uniforms, free for anybody who takes them. That's the community we live in, we work in. That's the level of poverty. People can't afford school uniforms. And I see the effects of poverty in the classrooms. Some of the behaviour is appalling, and that's largely due to deprivation and parents who don't back up the teachers as well. And that's the sort of thing we need independence to sort. We can fund our schools properly, finally. We can lift people out of poverty. We can fund community education programs to tell parents, get through to them how important education is. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
It's like pass the parcel with the microphone. I'll not speak without the mic just to make sure everybody can hear me. You know, in the last year since we were all together in Brechin, there's been, I think, lots of different things have happened, but there's two really important things that have happened for the independence movement. One of them is deeply sad, and the other one, I hope, is a sign of optimism. And if I cast my mind back to the reasons why I got involved in the independence movement and why I believe it's absolutely the most important political question in Scotland, is because of my early experience when I was in my career, looking after miners and their families as their industry and their communities were destroyed by Thatcherism. And it was alongside that disastrous social policy that led to gross inequality and serious health conditions. So that kind of background of seeing that up close, and to have always been aware that, you know, Nobody I knew was going to vote for Margaret Thatcher, but still she got back in every time. And it just underlined the difference between Scottish policy and Scottish values, the values that I felt were really important, and the values that we were having to adhere to. And so when I joined the independence movement as a member of the SNP, one of the things that I loved about that time was the broad church of political opinions and the ability to hold differences of opinion within a single party, because there was one galvanising objective, which was independence, and that was the thing that we were all able to get behind. And the last 10 years has taught us that that is a very fragile thing, and it can be lost quite easily. And the reason that that's been fractured in the last 10 years is because of the issue of women's rights. And so many of us found ourselves unable to express the opinions that we held within that broad church. But now that that has been resolved, albeit at very early stages, I hope that we can again shift the focus firmly back onto the cause of independence, because that's why I'm involved in politics. That is what we all want to see happen, because we want to solve the problems that exist in Scotland. You know, whether it's Grangemouth and the obvious difference between the way the Scunthorpe works have been treated and the Grangemouth people and Scotland's infrastructure and industry have been treated is so obvious. And the only difference between the two of them is that one of them is in England and the other one is in Scotland. That is the only difference. Regardless of ownership, regardless of priorities, that is the reason it is not being supported. And, you know, I can whine on about I wish the Scottish Government had done more to save it, but that's not helpful, really, to our preparations for independence. So I will continue to speak up on these things, and indeed so will Kenny, but we have to shift the focus back onto independence. Now, what have we tried to achieve in the last 10 years? And I use the term achieve very loosely, but we've had 3 requests for a Section 30 order from a First Minister of Scotland that has been rebuffed by Tory Prime Ministers. We've had case taken to the Supreme Court to ask for permission for the Scottish Government, or ask if they've got the powers to legislate for an independence referendum within their powers, only to be told, no, you can't. I've tried twice to amend the Scotland Act when I was in Westminster. The first time when I moved my private member's bill, it was ignored. The second time, the might of the UK parties voted it down, and there was, quite surprisingly, one Tory voted in favour of it, and I think there was a couple of Labour guys did so too. But it's very clear that Westminster, and by implication, don't forget, the Scottish Parliament is a body of the UK state. It is not the Scottish Parliament as in an independent Parliament. It is part of the UK apparatus. You know, we've tried to amend the Scotland Act, that failed. So anyone who is pushing the narrative that that is somehow a goer is, again, just kicking the can further down the road. We need to be realistic here. So that leaves us with one clear democratic test, and that is a de facto referendum in a Scottish election. The most appropriate way to demonstrate that is on the list vote, on the regional list in a Scottish parliamentary general election, and that has to be our objective. And the reason why that's important is because it's easy through that route to demonstrate greater than 50% of a democratic expression. I think can't remember who said that it needs to be clearly stated on the ballot paper. That does need to be clearly stated on the ballot paper, that that vote, whichever party you're voting for, is a vote for independence. Because we now know that we are ahead of the game. We're 12 points ahead. However, the SNP are only polling at 35%, so that's 27% of independent supporting people who are not prepared to give their vote to the SNP at the moment. Now, that is problematic, but what we have to do as a movement is make sure that those voters express their preference for independence on the list
to make sure that independence does happen. Now, as I said, and I will wrap up now, as I said before, the Scottish Parliament is a creature of the UK state. It can't make the decision about UDI or any of those things, a declaration of independence, and that's why a constitutional convention must follow after that election to develop a body that is able to communicate the decision that Scotland wishes to be an independent state. There's lots of other things I could say, but I think I've taken up quite enough time, but that's the basic narrative.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your opening statements. And I think I would like... Oh, sorry, Peter. Do you want to hear what Peter's got to say? Sorry, Peter, on you go.
That's what they came for.
Yeah, I'm the other one. I'm the odd one out. Yeah, I'm definitely the odd one out on this panel. Probably the most important way that I'm the odd one out is I'm not the only one. I'm the only one not standing for election. Right? So I'm not the only one who's not here tonight to make election speeches. I don't care about getting elected, and I don't care who gets elected. I only care that whoever is elected has an actual plan for restoring Scotland's independence. At the moment, none of them do. And that's what I want to rectify.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. And that was short but sweet. So we're cracking on here. I thought I was going to be even further ahead of schedule by excluding Peter from speaking there, but we're doing really well. And I would like to take some questions from the floor, if anyone has any they would like to ask at this moment. Yes, we have a question at the back.
How do you get on with the manifesto for independence? Do you have much response from independent parties, Peter?
Absolutely none, which is pretty much what you would expect, yeah. Because we're talking about the realities of Scotland's situation and the realities of what will be required to get us out of this situation, it stands to reason that the political parties will have no interest in it whatsoever. Because they're entirely focused on getting elected, and that is their sole focus. Whereas the Manifesto for Independence is actually the process by which Scotland's independence will be restored. But the big problem with the Manifesto for Independence, as far as the politicians are concerned, is it requires them to be courageous and imaginative and tenacious and bold and a lot of these other things that you just don't associate with politicians. So it was always going to be problematic. I never really expected to get any of the political parties on board. Am I being signalled? I'm being signalled that I should be speaking. I'm sorry, I should have been speaking into the microphone because there's some difficulty with the live streaming, and now I've totally forgotten what I said. But it had something to do with politicians all being self-serving cowards who are actually not prepared to face up to the reality of what will be required if Scotland's independence is to be restored. And I can say these things because I'm not looking for your votes.
So I can just come out and say what is actually the facts of the matter. And our situation is such that it's going to take something very dramatic to break the back of this, to break the union, and none of our politicians are prepared to do that. None of the parties are proposing any plan for restoring Scotland's independence, and that's what I'm interested in at the moment. That's what I'm interested in now. Sorry, listening to these other guys, one of the things that occurred to me was that, yeah, I've been there, you know, this position, that position, I've been there. I've travelled that route. I've been at this for 60 odd years, and you know, I've been through all of these things, and I've ended up at this place where I realise that none of it matters. There is a process. There's the things that have to be done, the actual practical things that have to be done, and that's what we should be focusing on. Hopefully, we'll get around to more detail on that. But no politicians, and. Yeah, to be frank, I don't miss them.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Anyone else with a question? Yes.
If MPs get elected in the next election, what do you say about holding an oath to the people of Scotland, the sovereign people of Scotland, other than maybe another country? You put Scotland people first, rather than
Eva, would you? Alan, oh, you would.
Yeah, I mean, just before the last election, myself, Eva, and Colette Walker from ISP wrote a letter to the Westminster Speaker explaining that we believe that the oath that is taken breaches the Equality Act. We got wishy-washy reply back. But what we plan to do is to say an oath to the people. Now, we will be forced to say the oath to the King once you're there. Otherwise, you're not able to take up your seat, and then you can't push anything else forward. But we will make it quite clear that every time we speak, we are speaking on our oath to the people, not to the monarch. Because we should not be forced to swear an oath to an unelected head of a foreign country.
ISP in the election will stand overtly against swearing to the monarch at Holyrood. And if we are elected, we will have a democratic mandate not to do so. So they cannot keep us out, regardless of how we swear. We will not swear to the monarch.
Well, as the only person who has suffered the indignity of having to go through that process, I certainly believed when I put myself forward in 2019 that we would be the last Scottish MPs that would need to go down there anyway. So it disappoints me that we even have to have this conversation. It's certainly not something I would like to do again, and not something I would want to do in the Scottish Parliament. And I'm going to draw on my many conversations with Sarah Sawyers and about her work. But you know, the fact is that King Charles is the English king. He is not the King of Scots. He has never ascended the throne in Scotland. He has never adorned the crown of Scots. He doesn't have any legitimacy in Scotland, and it's kind of a moot point for me because I have absolutely no intention of supporting a monarchy in an independent Scotland. I'm absolutely a Republican if that's what it makes me. I don't believe in any hereditary system of patronage, so I think we need to have a very frank conversation about the relevance of that. And I think what it does is it underlines something I've said already before, that the Scottish Parliament is a creature of the UK state. And we have to point that out. Whoever we are, whoever is elected, has to make that point absolutely clear.
Thank you. Would you like to say anything? Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Yes.
I think everybody here would agree there's a need for a constitutional convention as soon as possible. What can we do to achieve that constitutional convention?
Can I go for this?
Yes, you go for that first.
I don't think.
I don't think.
All right. Neil said something about constitutional convention after the 26th election, but I think he meant before it. No? Maybe?
Any time, but
Um,
definitely after if it's 50%.
Obviously, we were promised it in January 2020, and some will say the reason we didn't get it was because the pandemic intervened. I have a slightly different, perhaps jaded opinion as to why it's not happened so far. But as I alluded to earlier, if the First Minister can have a summit of anti-right politicians, if he can sit down and break bread and drink cups of tea and coffee with parties who are based in England, who are not Scottish-oriented, whose leaders have as a priority Westminster and the betterment of the British Exchequer as opposed to the betterment of the people of Scotland, then John Swinney as our First Minister should find it incumbent upon him to create that constitutional convention tomorrow. We say that every week on PRISM, and we're right. And the majority of the Scottish people support the notion of independence. We know this. As Neil has said, we're 11 or 12 points ahead in the polls as it is. So if John Swinney's listening, John Swinney would create that convention without delay. If he's not listening, then he has to be made to listen. And the way that you make somebody like him listen is to hit him in the ballot box. And that's why I'm seriously considering whether there should be opposition to the SNP in the constituencies or opposition to the SNP in by-elections. There's one coming up quite soon. So I would like to gauge what support there is within the room for a challenge to the SNP at by-elections, not under any circumstances to create a Scottish Parliament that is populated by a majority of unionists, but actually to dangle a stick in front of the SNP as opposed to a carrot, because the stick would be that perhaps Indie for Indie candidates would stand in all the constituencies and destroy the SNP majority. That is not my desired outcome, but I understand that the SNP leadership are currently out of step with the SNP membership and supporters, because the membership and supporters of that party in the main want to see a united campaign and also understand that SNP 1 and 2 at the Holyrood election will not be a success for the country, though it might be a success for the party. So it may very well be the case that the way to encourage the First Minister to have that convention is for people to begin to support the notion that the SNP's power and their might within the constituencies in the Scottish Parliament may be in grave jeopardy if they don't sit up, smell a coffee and do what the people of this country not only want but deserve and need.
It's constitutional convention is one of these things that people like to talk about. It sounds great. There's a lot of things like that that sound great, but I tend to ask questions about these things, and the question I ask about a constitutional convention is for what? You know, what is it going to do? What is it going to be empowered to do? What possible difference can it make? If there isn't a process identified that the constitutional convention can aid in some way, then what is the point? What does it do? That's it. It's the practicalities of the thing that I'm concerned with. And yes, at some point, a constitutional convention is probably a very good idea. A constitutional convention to help draft a provisional constitution, for example, a constitutional convention to help with oversight of a proper constitutional referendum. There is a place and a time for a constitutional convention, but at the moment it's just another one of these things that politicians like to talk about because it sounds good.
I'm going to respond directly to that point from Peter because it is really important. I mean, I know that we were promised a constitutional convention in 2020. Ash Regan, I think, asked for a constitutional convention to be called a few weeks ago, and we'll continue to ask for that. It's been a core part of our political process for independence. But in terms of its usefulness, it's absolutely vital. It is an absolutely central part of how we organise ourselves to communicate our desire for independence and, most importantly, the democratic expression of the people of Scotland once that has been done through an election or any other means. That's why it's so important. So in the legal opinion that I obtained from Professor Robert McCorkdale, who has dealt with these types of issues in real life, so was part of the Baltic states secession from the USSR, he understands and he has represented to the UN. This is someone of the highest legal pedigree when it comes to international law. He has made it clear that once that democratic expression has been reached, because of the arrangements between the Scottish Parliament as part of the UK state, an independent body must be formed to communicate to the UN and to the UK government to say, we are seeking independence, these are our terms. That is the fundamental purpose of it. And it's not just politicians. It must be politicians from every stripe and from Civic Scotland. You have to have broad representation because it's the voice of the people, because your democratic self-expression is the voice of the people of Scotland. That's why it's absolutely essential.
Neil's spot on. What the Constitutional Convention does is bring Civic Scotland to the forefront. It takes the politics out of the debate. The people are sick and tired of politics. They want their voices heard. And that is the way to do it. You take the politics out of it. Now, I could always remember campaign for the SNP in the 80s, 90s. We were getting bricks thrown at us because people did not like what we stood for. That has changed after a lot of hard work. You're now getting people stopping you in the street to speak to you about independence. If we don't stop this nonsense with the party politics, it's going to go back to the 80s and 90s, where people are going to start throwing the bricks again because they don't like the politicians or the political parties. We've got to get an organisation, and the Constitutional Convention is the best method of doing this, of taking the politics out of it and putting the people's agenda on the table.
The problem with the Constitutional Convention is the SNP lost all those MPs. So there's no guarantee that we would have a yes majority in a Constitutional Convention. And if we don't have a yes majority, what's the point?
Okay.
Quick one. Neil actually made my point for me there when he said that the Constitutional Convention comes after a decision has been made. And that is the point. That you have to have the constitutional decision made by the people of Scotland first, and then the Constitutional Convention comes into play. But until that decision has been made, then there is no purpose for a Constitutional Convention. It has no place, it has no legitimacy. It comes after. There is a process, and there is everything in that process has its place and its time. And the Constitutional Convention is part of that. Talking about it just now is just talking and demanding a constitutional convention. When politicians stand up in the Scottish Parliament and demand a constitutional convention, they're not actually wanting a constitutional convention, they're not expecting a constitutional convention, they haven't a clue what it would do. Their only purpose is to embarrass the SNP. Embarrass the other parties, because all they're fighting is elections. They're not fighting Scotland's cause. They're fighting electoral battles the whole time. There is a place for a constitutional convention. There is a time for a constitutional convention. We're not even at the point where we need to be talking about it.
I'll let Eva have a go at this too. We're going to have plenty of time for questions. So, Eva.
Just a wee quickie. The 2021 election led to a majority of votes for independent supporting parties if you add together the votes for SNP, Green and Alba. So on that basis, a constitutional convention is entirely legitimate.
Thank you.
Yeah, again, just on the Constitutional Convention, I'll take you back to 1992, when the Tories won the election. We called a Constitutional Convention. All the parties got together. The SNP, unfortunately, stayed out for a wee while. But then we started an organisation called Scotland United, along with the Constitutional Convention, and we got the Scottish Parliament because of that. If we do this again, it could be a campaigning organisation, not just of the political parties, but of the people of Scotland. And that's what we're needing. We're needing to bring everyone together and campaign. But we also have to not only vote with our hearts, we have to vote with our heads. Look at the election of 21. The SNP won vast majority of the constituency seats, but their voters transferred over to the SNP again on the list, and that gave seats to the Unionists, just because of the way the voting system works. We've got to use our heads and play the system. Now, a lot of people say, oh, you can't play the system. The system was started with the Unionists playing it, because it was to stop independence from ever happening. Alex Salmond fluked it. You cannot have a political strategy to do what Alec did. That was just pure fluke. For the SNP to take the majority in the Scottish Parliament, ask yourself, which constituency seats do you want them to lose? Because they will have to lose constituency seats to get seats on the list. That's just fact. So when you go out and vote, and we've got to get this across to the people, voting both votes for the same party doesn't work. You've got to be wise when you vote. If the SNP are going to be winning that constituency, then vote for an alternative independence candidate on the list. That's the only way we're going to get forward here.
I'll make one very small point, because it is quite important and in the broader sense, which is the notion that after a vote, if you don't have a majority of yes supporting parties in, like members or politicians in a constitutional convention, somehow that wouldn't allow the message to be communicated. But that's not how it works, because once the democratic expression from the people has been created and Civic Scotland are there, it doesn't matter what your stripes are, you're there as part of civic political Scotland, and you have to do the best for your country, because the people have said we are independent.
Thank you. Okay, what I'm going to do now is we'll take a wee break. You can maybe go to the bar and have a drink or whatever you want to do. We'll take a wee break, and then when we come back, we'll maybe have a wee session where members of the panel might want to ask questions of each other. I don't know how that'll go, but we'll give it a go anyway. And then I would really like to try and have a bit more time for any questions that might generate from the audience. So we'll take a wee break and try and start again by 8 o'clock sharp. Thank you.
to do if we're going to belief and that determination that Scots are no better than anybody else, but we're no worse either, where it should be on an equal platform with the rest of the population of the world and enjoy our independence, as opposed to becoming increasingly more frustrated, tense, anxious and stressed as the result of everything that we see crumbling round about us. So I think it's incumbent on everybody within the movement who is desirous of independence to be positive, to look at what tomorrow might bring and think about not simply the dream will never die, but think about how best we can make that dream a reality. And the way that you do that is to energise folk and to point out just how much better a country will be when we're doing it for ourselves, by ourselves, using a solution that is not a British solution. We don't play by the British rules, we make the rules in Scotland, for Scotland, by Scotland, and that's what a plebiscite would be.
I think... Right. Yep. People of Scotland will recognise it, and it's the people of Scotland that we are fighting for. Could you imagine the police coming to my door and arresting me? My whole street and the whole of Dundee will be out on the streets, because they will not allow their elected members who they've put their trust in to be arrested and treated as political prisoners. We've got to stand up and we've got to fight, and we've got to break the Westminster rules, otherwise we will never be independent.
I used to be, I was very dubious about the whole idea of a de facto referendum, a plebiscite election, because there's a very simple dichotomy there. A referendum has to be binary, and an election never is. And so I was dubious about it, but in the way that I did, I had a wee think about it, and I thought, well, how's about if there was a way to introduce a binary element to an election? And then I had another wee think about it, and I thought, aye, I ken how you could do that. How you could do that is if you had, let's call it a manifesto for independence. And if all the nominally pro independence parties signed up to that, if they all adopted it, if they all incorporated it into their election manifesto, identical manifesto for independence, then you've got the binary element that you need in order to have a de facto referendum. You turn it into effectively two different votes. There's the election, which is all about parties and the politicians and all that. And then you have the de facto referendum part of it, which is about that manifesto for independence. That is the same for all the parties. Therefore, you've got the binary element. People are either voting for that manifesto for independence or they're not. That's the binary element that you need. But it has to be all the political parties. This is what I mean when I'm talking about not fine speeches and rousing speeches, but actually addressing the practicalities of these things. How do you make a de facto referendum? It's all very well talking about a de facto referendum, making rousing speeches about the will of the Scottish people, etc. But how do you actually do that in practical terms? Well, I have suggested a way of doing it in practical terms. Maybe some of the other panellists have a better idea.
I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, yes. What's to stop John Swinney from standing up like Nicola Sturgeon used to do? If we say it's going to be a plebiscite election, if John Swinney stands up and says it's not, he shoots our fox.
Shoots his own fox.
Well, yes, but...
If John Swinney stands up and says he's not prepared to do it, then we'll bring them down, and we'll put other people in place that will do it. That's how you do it.
Fantasy politics. We'll bring them down and put other people in their place. When is that going to happen? When is that going to happen? It's not happening in 2026. That's a certainty. It's not happening in 2026. Well, I go by actual information that is available, the actual evidence, not the rhetoric. And the only evidence that we have is the evidence of the polling, which has shown that the SNP is going to be the largest party and will probably be the party of government. That is the reality. This idea that it's just going to sweep the SNP away is total nonsense, it's fantasy politics, and we need some hard-headed reality injected into this campaign. No more fantasy politics, for Christ's sake.
Okay, would you like to respond to that?
Peter says it's fantasy politics, won't happen. What happened at the last general election? Independent supporters brought the SNP down by staying at home and not coming out to vote. We have to change that so as they actually come out to vote and vote for other pro-independence party members or independents. Because only by using your vote will the SNP ever listen.
Yeah, I understand the emotion in the contributions, but the thing that I'm, there's no one who should be more opposed to voting SNP than Alex Salmond. Yet at the last election he did vote SNP, and he was very open that he did vote SNP because of a variety of other circumstances in this constituency up north. And although I have a grudge to bear against the SNP, I think that's pretty obvious to most folk for a variety of reasons. But I also know that there's a huge amount of people in the SNP who share my frustration about the lack of action, and they're as committed to the cause of independence as I am, and as determined to see it. And so, in some respects, certainly in this election, what we'll be doing is trying to speak to those people over the heads of the leadership where many of the issues, I think, are concentrated. Because we have to, as everybody said, we have to pull together. Now, there are a huge number of women in Scotland who've been badly affected by recent political developments. And now that that's been resolved, perhaps they will have a change of heart. But, they have told me lifelong supporters of independence will not vote for the SNP under any circumstances as a consequence of some of the policy choices. I can't tell anyone to vote for a party, but I think as long as you've got an independent supporting candidate, whether that's in the constituency on the list, and you put your weight behind them, particularly on the list if that is going to be the democratic expression and support of independence, then I think that's what we should do. I think it's very, very difficult to topple a party that's in such a strong position as the SNP, not necessarily because of their performance, but more because of the desire of the Scottish people to be independent. And so, I understand the emotion bound up in all of this, but I think there's probably a lot of truth in both of the contributions from Peter and Alan.
Okay, thanks. So if anyone else has a question, stick your hand up and I'll take the... There's Peter, right.
Well, there's one question for everybody who's proposing to or stand for election, asking for your vote, and on the basis that they're something more than just nominally pro-independence, because this is what you have to recognise, that in 2026, as things stand, in 2026, you cannot vote for independence. You cannot, because there is no party standing that actually represents any sort of proposal or plan for restoring Scotland's independence. They're using the word independence as an electioneering device, and that is all. And that applies to all of them. But there's one question that they all have to answer if they're going to be realistic about it, and that is, how do you address the matter of legislative competence? Because that is the key. You talk about routes to independence, and people say, oh, there's various routes, there's various ways of doing it, there's all sorts of ways to do it. That's nonsense. All these routes all converge on one point, and that is the point of legislative competence. The competence of the Scottish Parliament to legislate for a proper constitutional referendum, not a Section 30 referendum, not a Section 30 referendum disguised as transferred powers, but a proper constitutional referendum. The legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament is the key. So, the question you should be asking every single candidate is, how do you propose to address the question of legislative competence?
Well, who wants to answer that?
The claim of right. The Scottish Parliament, back in the day, used to pass bills that basically said, sue us. They didn't require royal assent. They just said, if you disagree, sue. And there was funding for ordinary citizens to do so back then. There's nothing to stop the Scottish Government from legislating under the claim of right. Absolutely nothing.
That's nonsense.
Right, well,
The law of Scotland.
No, I'll try and deal with both of those things as swiftly as I can. Well, in terms of legislative competency of the Scottish Parliament, that is a bit of a red herring because, as I've said a couple of times, It is a creature of the UK state, and it is under the control and at the mercy of the UK state. That's what it is. It is not a Scottish Parliament. It's called the Scottish Parliament, but it's not really. It's an administrative parliament for the UK in Scotland. And so its competency is, again, at the behest of the UK. They are not going to confer the rights, just as the UK Supreme Court are not going to rule in favour of breaking up the UK. It is just not going to happen. Hang on a second, let me finish my point, please, Peter. And so, although we've attempted to address that with Ash Regan's bill, which was a referendum on extending the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament, the reality is that, that might get stuck in the mud of legal disputes and get referred to the Supreme Court and all that kind of stuff. The legal position, the international legal position, is very, very clear. And I'll make one further point to this. It is under international law, as a people, the people of Scotland are a people for the purposes of the UN Charter. We can, with a proud and previous independent history. So there is no dispute that the people of Scotland exist. And when it comes to the right to self-determination under the UN Charter, it is a matter for the people to decide, not the state. That means that, and this is one of my big frustrations, is that means that the UK state should have had absolutely no role in our referendum in 2014. They had no place to be involved. UK parties should not have had a voice in that debate. That was for the people to decide. They should have had no role in it whatsoever. And that is the key. That's why we need a mechanism that's under our control, and that's why the list vote on the Scottish Parliament election is the cleanest way to get that majority. It is the only vehicle that exists. Extending the competency of the Scottish Parliament is playing the UK government's game. We've got to do something completely separate from that. And then going on to the claim of right. The claim of right is the basis of common law in Scotland, unlike most other jurisdictions, which is Magna Carta. But the tenets within that are not necessarily applicable in a modern context. Yes, there are arcane devices within that, but there are also things that are, incompatible with our communities today that are strongly anti-Catholic or whatever, a variety of things that are not relevant. It is the fundamental basis, but like with all common law, it develops over time. And so it's like so many things and activities that people are engaged in. They're very useful activities and they bolster the case for independence, but they will never vacate the need to have a democratic expression. That has to happen.
I mean, Peter talks about legislative competence. How many other colonies from the UK used legislative competence to free themselves from Westminster? None of them. They took the sovereign will of their people in elections, and that's what we must be doing. Now, every time we go into elections, we're playing by Westminster rules. And by seeking more powers to the Scottish Parliament, again, it's playing by Westminster rules. It's seeking their permission. Asking for a referendum is seeking their permission. All the time we are going cap in hand saying, please sir, can we have a little bit more? Well, do you know what? We're no longer asking for independence. We're going to be taking independence. And that means coming out and voting in a manner which the Unionists cannot stop. If we have a referendum, the Unionists could quite easily boycott that referendum and make it null and void. An election, they cannot do that. They have to come out because they do not want a nationalist government in power. So they cannot stay at home. The election in 2026 is very important because we need independence now and we have to vote for it. And once we get the democratic will of the Scottish people, then we go to the international community and get their support and we will be free.
Thank you. Unusually, perhaps, I find myself agreeing with a little bit of what all of these men have said. I agree with Peter that at the moment the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, Holyrood, does not have the legislative competence to run, for example, a referendum. And were there simply a vote to do with the Scottish Parliament in 26 in favour of independence, it would have to be very carefully managed, but by itself cannot bring independence. What you need to have is the electoral event whereby the people of Scotland vote and they know what they're voting for. And that's why it cannot be a referendum created in Scotland, because that's not lawful. So it has to be an election in Scotland, which is the first platform. It's not the end, it's the beginning, or it's the end of the beginning. So that what you desire is what I said earlier, a majority of seats and a majority of the popular vote, and that gets you through the door, where you're then saying to the UN, Scotland as a country, we satisfy all the qualifications necessary for lots of reasons, including culture, history, geography, language, arts, you name it. So we satisfy all of those criteria, and you then have international recognition from those countries that know full well that Scotland is a nation, and that Scotland is, as we've said, a country. Do you seriously believe that the majority of the UN are going to back Britain against the Scots after you've had innumerable instances of the empires of the world, including the British Empire, breaking down when people simply said, enough is enough, we're declaring independence? We're not doing that. We're having a vote. We're having a vote first and foremost, followed by international recognition, and what that can then lead to is an internationally constituted referendum which is binding, where it is put to the people, you voted before for this, here's one now that's a constitutionally binding referendum, a binary referendum, putting it beyond any doubt, and I'll guarantee you that would be internationally recognised, and at the moment we wouldn't win it, and the reason why we wouldn't win it is because for now we're not governed by competent government. So what we need to do between now and next year is ensure that we've got competent government reintroduced, and that instead of the leaders doing what they want, they start to do what we want, and that is getting round the table, talking about unity, and talking on the most serious of terms about that route map to independence, because I want to see it next year, and I don't think it's out of the question.
We've time for one more question from any panellist who's got something. If you don't, we can go back to the audience.
Yeah, back to the audience.
Happy to go back to the audience, right. Any members of the audience? Oh, here we are, desperate to get your question.
That was a bit of a faux pas. Look if I'm the microphone.
Right. This is for you, Peter, right, okay? Right. I've read your blogs and I've read your stuff, and I know that party that you've got. I've been speaking to people in the room. Most of us don't actually understand what you're trying to portray. So could you actually explain to us what you're trying to say? Just quickly, right? Because, well, do you know what I mean? I mean, these are people who've said the word, right? I just don't understand where you're coming from, what your process is. Thank you.
Thank you, because you've given me an excuse to do what I hope to do here, is to actually explain this. And it is difficult to do it and do it quickly, because what it involves is totally changing your whole mindset. And I hear a lot of people talking about having nothing to do with Westminster, but in the next breath they're saying that the Scottish Parliament's just an instrument of Westminster. Right. My attitude is that the Scottish Parliament is the Parliament of Scotland. It has to be the Parliament of Scotland, the national Parliament of Scotland, because it's directly elected, it's proportional representation, which actually works quite well, and it's the national Parliament of Scotland. It has democratic legitimacy. So, if independence is to happen, then it will be by a route through the Scottish Parliament. You ask, well, what is the thing that actually restores Scotland's independence? It's an act of the Scottish Parliament. It's not an act of the Westminster Parliament. That's them giving us independence. That we do not want. An act of the Scottish Parliament. So how do we get an act of the Scottish Parliament? The Scottish Parliament has to have the democratic legitimacy. To have a de facto referendum on independence is just silly, because the Scottish Parliament has no power to enact that. It has no power to deliver independence. So you're having a referendum on something that cannot be delivered. However, what you can do is have a referendum on the powers of the Scottish Parliament. You can have a referendum which says that the Scottish Parliament has powers to have a proper constitutional referendum. And it says a proper constitutional referendum, because you hear people talking about a referendum as if all referendums are the same, and it doesn't matter what it's like. It has to be the right kind of referendum, and only the Scottish Parliament can legislate for that. So, you make the 2026 election a referendum on the powers of the Scottish Parliament, on the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. How do you make it a referendum? I referred to this earlier. You make it a referendum by making it binary, by having all the nominally pro-independence parties adopt the same manifesto for independence, so that you've introduced that binary element which creates effectively two votes, the election, and then there's the de facto referendum part of it, where everybody who votes for any party, it takes party politics out of the campaign altogether, which we should all celebrate. Party politics out of the game. They all have exactly the same referendum commitment, the same manifesto commitment on the process of restoring independence. Therefore, they can't compete on the hustings on that basis. Party politics is out of it. Every single vote for any of these parties that have adopted the Manifesto for Independence is a vote for the Scottish Parliament to assert its legislative competence in matters relating to the Constitution, primarily and initially, proximally, for the purpose of legislating for a proper constitutional referendum which will stand as the exercise by the people of Scotland of a right of self-determination, there being no other way. Because that is the problem at the moment. We are not being denied independence. Our right of self-determination is not being denied. It's very carefully not being denied. What is being denied to us is access to the exercise of our right of self-determination. And we can only get that through the Scottish Parliament. This is why I say we have to take these things in steps. So that first step is a referendum in 2026 tied to the election, whereby we get a huge mandate for the Scottish Parliament to assert its legislative competence in the areas relating to the Constitution for the purpose of allowing the people of Scotland, enabling the people of Scotland to exercise our right of self-determination, there being no other way, and that being a human right. It is defined as a human right by the UN, and immediately we make the constitutional issue then becomes a human rights issue, And that puts us immediately at a great advantage, because if the British state wants to object to what we're doing, if it wants to challenge what we're doing, it's effectively challenging our human rights. And we are in the position of defending our human rights. So I'll try to summarise this as well as I can. But the process actually goes on from there. Once you have asserted, and you proceed as if you are a sovereign people. You proceed as if you are a nation. You don't wait for somebody to tell you that it's okay. You just keep on doing it. You do it. And then you say you deal with the consequences. If you keep waiting to see that it's going to be okay, you won't ever do anything. So we assert the competence of the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament then passes a bill which effectively dissolves the Union, subject to ratification by the people of Scotland in a referendum. And the Scottish Parliament then legislates for that referendum. And in the referendum you have a vote, not just a yes or no vote on independence, some vague notion of whatever independence is, but on an actual proposal, a proposal that is put forward by the Scottish Government. It's included in the bill, in the Act passed by the Scottish Parliament. It includes something like a provisional constitution and other matters, an actual proposal, and that is what we have the referendum on, and people say either they accept that proposal or they do not. And there you have a clear process that runs all the way through and has actual independence at the end of it. And none of the political parties are offering that now. Ask them if they were in government, what would be the first thing that they did, their first action as a government in order to restore Scottish independence, and none of them would have an answer.
Okay.
Sorry.
Could I come back to that?
Yes, please. Well, very briefly, because that's taking up a good chunk of the meeting.
What I want to say is what I want to say, Peter, is what you've just said there, right? There was a quote there that you said something about non-political parties, right? Okay. Indie for Indie is non-political party, so why can't they go into the Parliament and use that as their memorandum, whatever thingy, whatever you call it?
Do they have an actual manifesto for independence? That's the question. It's not who you vote for in 2026, it's what you vote for. If you focus on who you vote for, you're just voting for these political parties. You're voting for a logo and a slogan.
No, well, excuse me, Peter, we're not voting for the political party. There's Eva and Alan, if people who are going. You're voting for the person, not a political party.
It's not who you vote for, it's what you vote for. Unless these people actually have a clear expression of what they intend to do, then you're not. I'm getting a signal.
I think we really need to move on. There's only 10 minutes left of the meeting. I'm going to allow Neil a very brief.
Yeah, very, very quickly. So, my observations on Peter's plan are basically the following. It depends on politicians, because he's talking about electing people who will ultimately be politicians, so that's a little bit of a surprise. The second thing he's saying, no political party is trying to extend the powers of the Scottish Parliament. Well, Ashrigan has a bill to do exactly that has been rejected by the Scottish Parliament at the moment, so we are trying to do that. And the third thing, probably the most important thing really, is how are you going to explain that to the people of Scotland on the doorstep? How on earth are you going to tell someone that is what we're trying to do? That is not clear. People need to know that they're voting in favour of a very simple thing. It's like, it needs to be very clear. You're voting in favour of independence. That's what it's about. That's what we're asking you to support. Nothing else. Any other steps that have to be enacted after that, well, we'll just try and trim them down, because independence is the priority. We haven't got time to waste. Needs to be done in 2 to 5 years max. And the other thing, sort of along that kind of lines, when you're trying to articulate an argument against the right-wing actors in reform, you need a simple slogan that people understand. That's why, this slipped out in an interview that I did after Alec died, but the only reform Scotland needs is independence. People get that. That's how you get the message across to people. You can't explain for 10 minutes a complex route that people go, I have no idea where that leads us. And that's why I've got a problem with what Peter's just said.
I don't think the voters are as stupid as you imagine.
I'm not saying that they're stupid, Peter.
Right, well, we've got a few other people wanting to ask questions here, and so I'm going to go to the floor.
I think Peter's going an awful long way around something that's actually quite simple, right? When Peter speaks about you need legislative whatever, you don't need legislative anything, because what you're doing is you're accepting the British state's power over you by doing that. The other thing you don't want to do is attempt to do this through, as it were, the Scottish Parliament, because the Scottish Parliament is a product of the United Kingdom, right? Now, the UN Charter on self-determination actually tells you what it is. It's self-determination. Dead simple. For that you need two things. You need to ascertain the will of the people. That's quite easy. You could do that. Everybody's explained how to do that, right? The next thing you need is you need a vehicle by which you could present that. Now, the vehicle is not the Scottish Parliament as such, because as I say, that's a product of the United Kingdom. The vehicle is the people in the Scottish Parliament, because they have been voted by the Scottish people. It's dead simple. Self-determination. Self and determination backed up by the will of the people. That's it. Dead simple.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. It wasn't really a question, though, but it was welcome anyway. Any other questions? Yes.
In getting the parties, the pro-independence parties, to sign up to a manifesto for independence and all having the same thing on their ballot, how are you going to get them all to cooperate? Because party politics would enter into it, and if, for example, if Alba proposes something, the SNP is going to reject it automatically because Alba has proposed it, and very likely the same procedure, between the other parties.
Right. Who wants to go first on that? You.
How do we get the politicians to do what we want? Is basically the question. And the only answer to that, how do we get the politicians to adopt this manifesto for independence? Only the power of the people can do that. Only the strength of the people can do that. People don't actually have power. They have strength. They only have strength in combination. So the independence movement has to come together on this. Not all the parties getting together. That's never going to happen. That's fantasy politics. But they can all have unity of purpose. And if, the only way to get this to work is if there's some sort of mass movement by the independence movement, some sort of mass campaign. So that's why they set up the Manifesto for Independence petition to get people to sign that. If there's if there's tens of thousands of people demanding that the parties, the nominally pro-independence parties, if there's thousands, tens of thousands of people demanding that they adopt the manifesto for independence, maybe we'll get them to listen. Maybe. And I know, I recognise what you're saying, that they don't listen, they don't pay any attention, they don't follow our lead. That doesn't alter the fact that that's exactly what we need them to do. And if we give up on trying to get them to do it, then what the hell hope is there for us? We have to try and force the parties. The political parties are not going to do it on their own. They're not going to volunteer for doing anything effective to restore Scotland's independence. They're only going to do it if we force them to do it. So that's why I'm asking everybody to sign the Manifesto for Independence petition in the hope that we can actually get the politicians forced to commit to actually doing something about it instead of just talking about it when they're looking for our votes.
Thank you. Is anyone?
I've got to be honest and say, in the 35 plus years that I've been campaigning, I've never once been asked by a member of the public for a manifesto. We have to make sure the people of Scotland know exactly what our candidates are standing for, and that is a strip line on the ballot paper, putting independence on that ballot paper. That is what people will then be voting for.
How? How are you going to put independence on the ballot paper?
Because you get a strap line.
You're allowed to put a descriptor up.
Are they all going to be, is everybody going to have the same?
That's what we're hoping to have.
And ISP will have Liberate on it.
Can you wait till you get the mic?
Would you like? Yes. I for I and ISP have joined with Salvo to form Liberate Scotland. What Peter's asking for is already done, because Salvo are the mass movement that Peter's talking about. Peter obviously doesn't have any faith in Salvo, and the elephant in the room is Liberation are going to the UN. By the time the 26th election comes around, they could have had recognition at the UN, which will change all this. Because the UN Decolonisation Committee will come riding into town and bang heads together in Westminster and Edinburgh.
That's not the way it works.
How much legitimacy do you need? The whole of the UN behind you? Is that not legitimate?
Thanks. Eva, please.
Thank you. Liberation and Liberate Scotland are two different entities. Liberate Scotland is an organisation whereby we, as Indie for Indie, ISP and others, want to galvanise the independence support so that for Holyrood 26 we have what I said earlier, one candidate on the constituency for independence so that we're not competing with each other, and a proper coordinated presence on the list so that we maximise the independence support and vote. That's a start. But as I said earlier, it's the end of the beginning, it's not the end. But it's a concerted effort like that that has to be made. The conundrum or the difficulty that we've got is, for the time being, neither the SNP nor the Greens have given any indication that they will actually cooperate. ALBA want to cooperate with others. ISP want to cooperate with others, and Indie for Indie is cooperating with others. So it's why I said earlier too that to bring the SNP round you need to choose between the carrot and the stick. Because there is absolutely no point in selling to the electorate that if you want independence, you vote SNP in the constituency and 8 other on the list. If we're going to end up with the same set of SNP representatives that we've had for the past 10 years and a few new ones who adopt the same attitude, because that leadership is out of touch with the members and the supporters and the people of Scotland who want independence. So all of this that we're talking about is meaningful, but is only going to take us somewhere if with a mechanism by which we persuade the SNP leadership to campaign for independence and create a route map for independence. Everybody in this room wants to see that. Probably at least half of Scotland wants to see it. John Swinney has to explain what it is. He has to set it out. Pete Wishart claimed to know what it was, and we're still waiting for his plan. We've had innumerable instances of SNP politicians talking about independence because they're all at the moment vying for positions and having elections in constituencies to decide who their candidates are going to be. Suddenly they, in the leadership, are using the word independence again. Well, I challenge them to tell us how they propose to attain that independence, because if they're going to be the biggest party, that's the job that they've got to do. If they are the biggest party and they don't have a route map for independence come 2026, can you imagine the state that Scotland will be in by then? You know, they will leave us at the mercy of Westminster, and we've watched that Labour austerity unfold to become even worse in some respects than Tory austerity was. How can that be? So, if John Swinney and those around him actually are desirous of independence, the onus is on them to spell out the how, the where, and the when without delay.
Would anyone else like to comment? Okay, I've time for one more question, if anyone has one. Okay, away at the back.
For the last couple of years I've been...
Right.
Does somebody here want that question? Sorry. No. I'm here for you.
All right, okay. Hi guys. What I wanted to ask is, I've been sitting here, obviously, I'm right at the back of the room, and I've been watching everybody's body language as you've been talking tonight. And all I've seen is it getting more and more divisive, and we're already, yes, we already support independence, and we're already looking and going, don't agree with you, Neil. No, Peter, you're talking shit. So, if you want to get the rest of Scotland to be standing behind you, to vote for you, how are you going to do that at the doors? How are you going to get people to fire up and get passionate about voting for you for an independent Scotland? Oh, and Peter, your hat game's strong.
Okay, thanks for that question. Neil, you go first.
I'll be really quick because it's the last question. Well, I don't have a problem with healthy debate or argument, certainly in a forum like this, where we're all fellow travellers and we're trying to work out what the best route forward is. I welcome it. I welcome the discussion. I welcome everything that Peter said. You know, you've got to challenge each other to come up with the right approach. And none of us have the answers to everything. And so I don't feel that this has been divisive at all. Might not agree with everybody, but then, when we're an independent country, we won't agree with each other on everything, and that's how democracy works. So at the end of the day, it's not about all singing from one single hymn sheet or, weasting on this or that. We've got to have grown-up debate. That's what we did brilliantly in 2014. We had heated debates all over the country about how things could be, and it was magical.
I mean, I'm hoping by the time 2026 comes around, we will have a united movement. But we'll not get that until we put pressure on those who can make it happen. Now, one of the reasons I've got to say it's very selfish, because I do not want to stand for Parliament. But if the movement is not united and we have a candidate in Dundee who is not going to push the independence forward, then I will stand against them. So the people of Dundee have a chance to vote for independence. I don't want to do that. I want all the parties, all the independents and all the movement to come together. And the way to convince the people on the streets is to make it affect them. Tell them exactly where the problems are coming from. Tell them how much the shackles are on the Scottish Parliament. We're spending more money mitigating Westminster policies than we are spending on what we're supposed to be spending. We've got to get that out to the people that Westminster is harming them, and the only way they'll get free from that is through independence.
Short and sharp and to the point for once. I agree with you that this has seemed a bit divisive, but as Neil has said, it's open and honest and healthy debate because we're all after the same final outcome. We just are not altogether certain what's the best way to go about achieving it. But when you're saying how do you sell it on the doorsteps, I've been chapping doors and delivering leaflets in the Scots Independent for 5 decades, believe it or not. And up until very recently, the argument always was, what's the point, what's the benefit in leaving the union? Well, it's flipped in recent years because now the argument should be, look at the cost of the union. We can't afford to remain within the union, as opposed to in the past the argument was about, can Scotland afford to run herself by herself? And I say that very, very deliberately because the cost of the union for far too many Scots is in fact failing to reach their potential, whether that's in terms of education or employment or ambition, and it's also at times premature death, whether that's by way of addiction or illnesses and events that occur because you're born into and you remain living within cyclical generational poverty. I say that as somebody who has worked in Clackmannanshire, Stirling and Falkirk as a lawyer for 4 decades, and over that time I've watched the same families and the same folk come and go with the same problems year in, year out, decade after decade, and I'm sick to my stomach watching my fellow countrymen and women, my neighbours, my friends, my relatives, just watching people suffer unnecessarily in a land of plenty, where at the moment our energy resources are being stolen, we are being plundered on a daily basis, the plans are afoot for Grangemouth to dissolve, as we've said already, and instead of our country thriving, we have far too many of our people on the scrap heap, and it is high time that that stopped. So I would chap every damn doorstep and every door in Scotland and plead on every doorstep that people waken up and understand that when we control our own resources, our people will prosper. We will secure bairns, not bombs. The working poor will be a thing of the past. Our NHS will be funded and there'll be no more mothers crying at the funerals of children who died prematurely through heroin or other addiction.
On divisive, division is a natural part of it's part of human nature, and it's a natural part of politics. If there wasn't any division, there wouldn't be any politics. Democracy is our way of getting through these divisions without killing one another, hopefully. So when people talk about division as if it's a bad thing, be cautious about what they're saying, because division is perfectly natural. It's the way we deal with division that matters. On the doorsteps, one of the advantages of the making the 2026 election a de facto referendum, a plebiscite on the powers of the Scottish Parliament as opposed to just on independence, is one you can clearly define. You can absolutely define what the powers of the Scottish Parliament are that you're aiming for. So you can be absolutely clear about that on the doorsteps. There's also the fact that there's various sources tell us that the people are more likely to vote for the powers of the Scottish Parliament than they are to vote just for independence. There's more support for the Scottish Parliament having more powers than there is for independence. So you've actually got an easier sell on the doorsteps. And the one other thing is that people were talking about ending poverty and all the rest, and it's all great, but independence is about one thing. It's an end in itself, because it's about ending an injustice, an ancient injustice that affects every one of us every single day. The Union is an ancient injustice, and independence is about rectifying that injustice. All the rest of it is gravy. If we rectify that injustice, everything else opens up to us.
Right, well, thank you very much, and that's just about the end of this meeting. So I would like to thank the panellists for coming along. I think that's been a really enjoyable evening, certainly enlightening in some respects, but I would like to compliment the panellists on their conduct here. We seem to make an awful lot about the divisions in our movement, but in actual fact, it's what holds us together that's really important, and that is the cause of independence, and that's what we're all here for. So I would like to ask you to show your appreciation to the panellists in the usual manner. And I would like to thank you, the audience, for your questions and for your attendance tonight, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Vote of thanks from the chair as well.
And I would just, I don't know how good a chair I was, but nobody actually got killed, so. and keep this in mind, sometimes it looks really hard, the journey, how are we going to get there, the process and all that kind of thing. But everything is heading the one way. Yes. And what must it be like for the unionists? Because they know it's coming to an end. They can't stop it forever. Thank you very much.
Hello, just one quick thing, Kenny. On behalf of Yes Brechin, I'd just like to say a great big thank you to Eva and to Peter. Well, one Peter and the other Peter. And then also to Neil and to Alan for taking the time to come to speak to us tonight. That was really good, because you've come a fair distance, and some of you have got a fair distance to go back again as well. Kenny, you've done pretty well. You've controlled what I would call at times a feisty panel, right? But that's okay. That's okay. That's what it's all about. You're allowed to say what you think and what you would like, because it doesn't matter whether you agree with everybody, because if we all agreed with somebody, good God, we'd be bored, But the important thing for everybody here is that we've got one common purpose, and we might go about it slightly differently, but if we get there in the end, we'll forget all these wee arguments we had, because we'll have made it. And if I haven't made it, well, what on earth are we doing here? I'd also like to say thank you, not only to Kenny and our panel, but also to Jason for Independence Live, because he's done a lot of work. There's somebody who's not here, it's Drew, who did the lights and the sound for us, and I believe he's coming back later to take it all away. At least I hope so, because I haven't got space in my house. But anyway, we'll see. So anyway, finally, there's no hotel staff here, but if it wasn't for the Northern Hotel, we wouldn't be able to hold this. So our thanks go to them for giving us this hall. And anyway, just think, if you're going back tonight and you think, okay, there's one thing I've remembered from tonight, and it's a good thing about independence, for heaven's sake, tell somebody else. Because if we don't spread the word, nobody's going to hear us. So, finally, you can shut up now, but finally, thank you everybody for taking the time to come tonight. It's good.